On the afternoon of 9th of January 2008, at approximately 12:30 p.m., at 10 Pass Ross Street, Ravensbourne, a suburb of Dunedin, New Zealand, an unannounced visitor entered the family home of 22-year-old economics honours student Sophie Elliott. According to the 111 emergency call log, her mother heard a scream shortly thereafter, and a responding police officer found the visitor, former lecturer Clayton Weatherston, locked inside Sophie's bedroom. When asked what he had done, Weatherston said simply, "I killed her." In that moment, what had appeared to be a normal domestic visit became the starting point of a homicide investigation. What would become clear only later was how the routine actions of both young women and the accused would be reconstructed into a layered evidentiary timeline, institutional response, and legal outcome. On the morning of 9th of January 2008, Sophie Elliott arrived at the family residence at 10 Pass Ross Street, Ravensbourne, Dunedin, to pack her belongings in anticipation of relocating to Wellington the next day to start a job at the Treasury. She had completed her economics honours degree and was preparing for the next chapter of her professional life. She followed her routine that morning. Coffee on the deck overlooking the harbour, a quick phone call to her mother to coordinate the day's tasks, and then organising clothes and personal items in her room near 11:45 a.m. The house sat on a quiet residential street with harbour views, typical of Dunedin's hillside suburbs. Meanwhile, Clayton Weatherston, her former university tutor and briefly her romantic partner, was working at the department offices at the University of Otago Economics faculty, completing marking for his students. At approximately 12:10 p.m., he left the office and drove his car to Ravensbourne, a trip of about 10 minutes through Dunedin's northern suburbs. By 12:30 p.m., Weatherston arrived unannounced at the house, telling Sophie's mother he had a farewell present for Sophie. The ordinary routines of a young student preparing for a career move and a tutor making what appeared to be a social call intersected that day. The arriving visitor's time of entry becomes a fixed anchor for investigators, a documented moment when everyday movement transitions into evidential timeline. What seemed like a normal gesture of goodwill would become the subject of intense forensic scrutiny. In the hours prior, Sophie's mother, Leslie Elliott, had left the home briefly to run errands in central Dunedin, leaving her daughter in the south-facing bedroom, window open to the light breeze off Otago Harbour. Weatherston's presence at the door at 12:30 p.m. did not alarm her. She believed the former tutor was dropping something off as a farewell gesture before Sophie's move to Wellington. Sophie greeted him at the door and took the gift into her room. At approximately 12:33 p.m., her mother heard a muffled noise from the direction of Sophie's bedroom, returned to the hallway, and found the door of Sophie's bedroom closed. She assumed the visit was proceeding normally and returned to the kitchen. The scene remained undisturbed for a minute or two until at about 12:35 p.m., the mother heard a sudden and violent scream. She immediately moved toward the bedroom but found the door locked from the inside. She called 111 and remained near the kitchen while the operator logged the call at 12:36 p.m. as female screaming, urgent medical assistance required, with the location given as 10 Pass Ross Street, Ravensbourne. The operator dispatched police and ambulance services immediately. The 111 call log time gave the first institutional timestamp for the incident, a moment when private crisis entered public record. The call itself would later be analysed for background sounds and timeline precision. By 12:38 p.m., constables from the New Zealand Police were en route from Dunedin Central Station, arriving at the residence at approximately 12:44 p.m. They found the front door unlocked, as Leslie Elliott had left it open for their arrival, entered, and located Weatherston locked inside Sophie's bedroom. The door had to be forced open. At 12:45 p.m., Constable John Cunningham asked him what had happened. Weatherston replied, "I killed her." Sophie was found collapsed on the floor beside her bed with multiple stab wounds and was pronounced dead at the scene by ambulance officers who arrived moments later. Investigators documented an immediate cordon of the room and recorded the gift wrapping lying on the bed, an ordinary object now converted into evidence. The room showed signs of struggle: overturned furniture, blood spatter on walls and bedding, defensive positioning of the body. The routine of a domestic visit had been transformed into a homicide scene. The gift wrapping becomes an evidentiary artifact, marking the transition from everyday gesture into crime scene documentation. Prior to 2008, the property at 10 Pass Ross Street had no criminal incidents on record, though it lay within a neighbourhood of historic homes built in the early 20th century. The University of Otago's economics department had received no disciplinary complaint against Weatherston before the incident, and colleagues described him as professionally competent if somewhat aloof. This background context shows normal institutional contexts before the collapse into investigation. On 9th of January 2008 at 2:05 p.m., the crime scene unit arrived and began processing the bedroom under the direction of Forensic Officer Senior Sergeant Maria Smith. She catalogued 216 separate injuries on Sophie's body, 216 stab and cut wounds, plus 7 blunt force injuries that would be recorded in detail during the autopsy. The sheer number suggested prolonged, sustained violence. She also documented a kitchen chef's blade missing from Weatherston's flat and scissors located in the bedroom near the body. The bedsheet and carpet were photographed from multiple angles and swabbed for DNA. Blood spatter patterns on the walls were marked and measured for later analysis. At 3:30 p.m., the initial forensic walkthrough concluded, and the bedroom was sealed with police tape. The invocation of standard forensic protocol, photography, swabbing, evidence tagging, and documentation marked the shift from the immediate emergency response into methodical evidence accumulation. The sheer volume of injuries suggested sustained violence rather than impulsive action. Each wound would need to be catalogued, measured, and cross-referenced with potential weapons recovered from the scene. Standard procedure required that every item in the room be photographed in situ before collection, labelled with exhibit numbers, and logged into the evidence chain of custody system. The bedroom became a grid of numbered evidence markers, each yellow tag representing a potential piece of the investigative puzzle. Why Weatherston brought a chef's knife from his flat to the suburban home would become a central question in establishing premeditation versus spontaneous violence. Later that afternoon, Detective Senior Sergeant Alan Brown of the New Zealand Police initiated witness interviews. At 4:10 p.m., he spoke to Sophie Elliott in the living room of 10 Pass Ross Street, recording her recollection of hearing the scream at 12:35 p.m. She also indicated that Weatherston had arrived alone and had invited himself in with the mention of a farewell gift for Sophie. She described his demeanour as calm and ordinary when he arrived. The mother's statement provided a narrow timeline window: Weatherston's entry at 12:30 p.m., the scream at 12:35 p.m., the 111 call at 12:36 p.m. This gave investigators a 5 to 6 minute window for the violent events inside the locked bedroom. At 4:40 p.m., Brown interviewed Weatherston at the Dunedin Central Police Station, recording Weatherston's statement. "I killed her." He identified the knife recovered from the scene as originating from his flat, but initially claimed he had only intended to frighten Sophie, not harm her. This claim would be tested against the physical evidence. The initial interviews established the human actors and their statements. Institutional procedure required recorded interviews within 24 hours of incident to preserve memory accuracy. Interview transcripts become key to comparing subsequent forensic findings, what participants remember versus what physical evidence reveals. The gap between Weatherston's stated intention and the documented outcome of 216 wounds would shape the investigation's direction. Detective Brown noted in his case, log, subject's account inconsistent with scene evidence. Further forensic analysis required. By the morning of 10th January 2008, forensic pathologist Dr. Martin Sage performed an autopsy at Dunedin Hospital's mortuary facility. He concluded Sophie died from rapid blood loss caused by 2 wounds penetrating her heart and 1 puncturing her lung, with additional deep incisions to neck arteries. The autopsy report documented the sequence of injuries in clinical detail: initial defensive cuts to hands and forearms, followed by deeper penetrating wounds to torso, neck, and face. The pattern suggested Sophie had attempted to protect herself before being overwhelmed by the attack. Dr. Sage noted that the defensive wounds on Sophie's hands and arms indicated she was conscious and attempting to ward off the blade during the initial phase of the attack. The depth and angle of the fatal wounds suggested significant force applied with a long-bladed instrument consistent with a chef's knife. The report would later become a key prosecution exhibit demonstrating the sustained nature of the violence. Meanwhile, investigators executed a search warrant at Weatherston's flat at 9:15 a.m., recovering the chef's knife with matching blade length and the scissors described in the initial scene documentation. The knife block in Weatherston's kitchen showed 1 empty slot corresponding to the recovered weapon. At 11:30 a.m., DNA swabs from the bedroom sheet matched Weatherston's profile, while a trace of Sophie's blood was found on the handle of the knife recovered from the scene. These findings added forensic weight to the statements collected. The change from raw crime scene into comparative forensic data marked the investigation's shift into evidence accumulation. The presence of Sophie's blood on the knife handle changed the inquiry from what happened to how and why did this level of violence occur. On 12th January 2008, at 2:00 p.m., the police executed a digital forensics warrant on Weatherston's university-issued laptop and mobile phone. Detective Constable Sarah Mitchell led the digital analysis. In his mobile call log, Weatherston had called Sophie at 11:47 a.m. on 9th January, and again at 12:18 p.m., 12 minutes before his arrival at her home. His phone's location metadata pinged a cell tower serving Ravensbourne at 12:20 p.m., placing him in the area 10 minutes before the documented arrival time. The laptop's browser history revealed a visited page titled Blood Loss from Penetrating Chest Wound, Medical Overview, accessed at 11:55 a.m. on the morning of 9th January. The page, from a medical reference website, detailed the physiological effects of stabbing injuries to the torso. Mitchell recorded in her report, "These digital traces establish presence and possible premeditation." The browser history is particularly significant given the nature of injuries inflicted. The digital footprints turned routine phone and computer use into documented evidence of movement and possible intent. Cell tower technology can locate a device within several hundred meters. In this case, the 12:20 p.m. Ping placed Weatherston's phone in the Ravensbourne area exactly 10 minutes before his documented arrival at the Elliott residence. The browser history raised immediate questions about intent. Medical searches conducted hours before a violent death suggest planning rather than spontaneous action. Digital forensics extended the timeline backward and forward, enabling investigators to map behavior across the critical morning hours. The call at 12:18 p.m. suggested Weatherston may have been attempting to confirm Sophie's presence at home before driving there. What seemed routine on the surface had already begun to unravel in the data. The digital trail would become crucial in the Crown's case for premeditation. On 4th of May 2008, at the High Court of New Zealand in Christchurch, Judge Judith Potter presided over the committal hearing, during which Weatherston entered a plea of not guilty to murder, but pleaded guilty to manslaughter. The Crown rejected the manslaughter plea and proceeded with a murder charge. The court hearing allowed the Crown to outline the 216 wounds, the chef's knife brought from Weatherston's flat, the digital browser history, and the DNA match as key elements of their case. 2 psychiatrists for the defense testified Weatherston had narcissistic personality disorder, a diagnosis that would become central to his defense strategy. The psychiatric reports suggested this personality disorder contributed to an inability to regulate emotional responses, particularly to perceived rejection or criticism. The defense would argue this constituted a partial defense under New Zealand law. The committal hearing formalized the Crown's case and pushed the investigation into full trial preparation phase. Investigation moved into legal institution. The data gathered over 4 months was formally entered into prosecution files and organized for courtroom presentation. The defense argument centered on provocation, that Sophie's behavior had triggered a loss of self-control in Weatherston, reducing murder to manslaughter. The Crown argued the evidence showed deliberate, sustained violence inconsistent with loss of control. The 216 wounds, the knife brought from elsewhere, the browser history, and the timeline all pointed toward planning and deliberate action. The shift from investigation into courtroom strategy elevated institutional context. Evidence would now be tested under adversarial examination rather than accumulated through procedural inquiry. Both sides began preparing witness lists and expert testimony for the trial scheduled for mid-2009. Between May and June 2009, forensic teams conducted deeper analysis in preparation for the upcoming trial. Blood spatter analysts from the Institute of Environmental Science and Research produced a report dated 20th of June 2009, showing directional study of blood droplets on the bed's headboard, walls, and ceiling matched an upright attacker position with overhead striking motions. The lab report referenced exhibit codes FSA 309 and FSA 310, corresponding to swabs taken from the headboard and eastern wall. The blood spatter pattern indicated sustained overhead striking motions rather than defensive or chaotic movement. This finding contradicted any suggestion of mutual struggle or loss of control during a heated argument. The arterial spray patterns suggested Sophie was in a defensive position on the floor, while the attacker remained standing and mobile. The analysis documented at least 40 separate impact events based on distinct spatter patterns. Simultaneously, the mobile phone ping sequence from 12:15 to 12:40 p.m. was reviewed and correlated with witness statements and house entry logs. Detective Brown noted in his case file, "The cell tower data confirms Weatherston's arrival window aligns with recorded timestamps at 12:30 p.m. The digital trail provides independent verification of timeline. The layering of multiple forensic disciplines, blood spatter analysis, digital forensics, pathology, DNA analysis, demonstrates the evidence accumulation process typical of major crime investigations. Cross-discipline correlation enhances confidence in timeline reconstruction and challenges defense narratives. Each independent analysis reinforced the others, building a composite picture of deliberate violence sustained over several minutes between 12:30 and 12:36 p.m. The forensic work transformed physical traces and digital metadata into a coherent narrative of events. On 22nd of July 2009, after a 5-week trial at the High Court in Christchurch, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of murder against Weatherston. The trial had included testimony from over 40 witnesses, presentation of extensive forensic evidence, and cross-examination of Weatherston himself, who spent 3 days on the witness stand defending his actions. The defense argument of provocation, that Sophie's alleged taunting and belittling behavior had caused Weatherston to lose self-control, was rejected by the jury after deliberations lasting approximately 8 hours. The Crown's case, built on the accumulated forensic evidence, timeline reconstruction, digital browser history, and the sheer extent of injuries, proved persuasive to the jury. Prosecutor Robin Bates argued that the 216 wounds demonstrated sustained, deliberate violence incompatible with momentary loss of control. The prosecution presented the browser history as evidence of planning, the timeline as evidence of deliberate travel to the victim's home, and the forensic pathology as evidence of prolonged attack. In her sentencing remarks on 15th of September 2009, Judge Potter described the killing as deliberate and controlled, and imposed life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 18 years. The judge noted the extreme extent of the injuries, the evidence of planning through digital searches, and the lack of genuine remorse demonstrated during testimony. She stated, "This was a sustained and brutal attack on a defenseless young woman. The institutional resolution of the investigation arrived via legal mechanism. Evidence had been methodically presented through forensic reports, digital logs, medical autopsy findings, and witness statements, culminating in judgment. The verdict marked closure of the institutional process, even if human questions remained about the psychological dynamics and ultimate motivations behind such extreme violence." On 7 April 2011, the appeal hearing in the Court of Appeal addressed whether extensive media commentary had prejudiced the trial and whether cross-examination of Weatherston under Evidence Act 2006, Sections 37 and 38 was conducted within legal bounds. The defense argued that substantial media coverage, including public criticism of Weatherston's demeanor and testimony in court, had created a prejudicial environment that may have influenced the jury despite judicial directions. They also challenged the scope of cross-examination regarding Weatherston's character, previous relationships, and his conduct during testimony. The Crown responded that proper judicial directions to the jury had been sufficient to ensure fairness, and that the cross-examination was necessary to test the provocation defense. On 13 September 2011, the Supreme Court declined leave to appeal, finding no grounds for overturning the conviction. The Court of Appeal had earlier ruled that while media coverage was extensive and at times inflammatory, proper judicial directions to the jury had been sufficient to ensure a fair trial. The cross-examination was found to be within the bounds of the Evidence Act and necessary given the nature of the defense raised. These legal proceedings confirmed the integrity of the institutional process up to the highest level of New Zealand's appeals system. Although the investigation phase was closed years earlier, legal scrutiny persisted through the appellate system as required by law. Appeals review procedure focuses on fairness and legality of trial processes rather than reinvestigating factual findings. The legal pathway from initial investigation through trial to final appeal had run its complete course through the justice system. By the time the Supreme Court decision was delivered on 13 September 2011, the institutional record included comprehensive autopsy reports, multiple forensic analyses, digital device logs, cell tower location data, DNA evidence matches, and extensive trial transcripts running to thousands of pages. Weatherston's defense of provocation was rejected at trial and on appeal, with courts finding the evidence inconsistent with loss of control. The institutional conclusion, guilty verdict, life sentence with 18-year non-parole period, no successful appeal, stands in the public record. Investigative bodies archived the case under the major offence homicide category with full evidence preservation. The procedural cycle, investigation, prosecution, adjudication, appeal, reached its statutory end. The record shows the full pathway from crime scene to final judgment. Initial emergency response at 12:44 p.m. on the 9th of January 2008. Forensic processing through January and February 2008. Committal hearing in May 2008. Trial in July 2009. Sentencing in September 2009. Court of Appeal decision in April 2011. And final Supreme Court denial in September 2011. The case moved through each institutional stage according to legal requirements and procedural standards. Nevertheless, some questions remain in the documented record that institutional processes cannot fully resolve. The psychological triggers for the violence, how Weatherston moved from arrival with a gift at 12:30 p.m. to sustained stabbing minutes later, include digital browser history and phone logs, but cannot reveal every dimension of motive with absolute certainty. The institutional record documents actions and outcomes, but cannot fully penetrate human psychology. The psychological diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder was offered by defense psychiatrists and accepted as factually accurate, yet no major mental illness defense succeeded at trial. Courts distinguished between personality disorder and legal insanity or diminished capacity. The institutional record leaves open the gap between factual chronology and complete understanding of human motive. The final documented detail shows the precision of investigative timeline reconstruction. At 12:20 p.m. on 9th January 2008, Weatherston's mobile phone registered a cell tower ping in Ravensbourne, 10 minutes before his documented arrival at 12:30 p.m. at 10 Pass Ross Street. The investigation concluded, the verdict entered, the sentence imposed, appeals exhausted, and yet some dimensions of what happened remain in the evidentiary record without full explanation. The case file confirms institutional outcome and acknowledges the inherent limits of legal inquiry into the complexities of human behavior and motivation. At 12:20 p.m. on 9th January 2008, Weatherston's mobile phone pinged the Ravensbourne cell tower. By 12:30 p.m., he was at 10 Pass Ross Street, a routine timestamp becoming the key link between ordinary movement and fatal violence. What had seemed like a farewell visit, documented first in a 111 call log at 12:36 p.m., became the foundation of a forensic timeline spanning from digital searches at 11:55 a.m. through to discovery 6 minutes after the emergency call. The timestamp, unremarkable in the moment of its creation, anchored the entire investigative reconstruction.